The farmer's life had always been one of silence. Each evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, his small cabin stood lonely against the horizon, the emptiness inside echoing louder than the coyotes that howled across the plains. Neighbors whispered about his solitude, some with pity, others with ridicule, mocking the quiet man who had no wife, no children, no legacy. Their laughter carried on the wind, sharp as thorns, yet he endured it without a word, hiding his pain beneath the weight of long days in the field. In truth, the loneliness gnawed at him. Every crack of the wooden floor, every creak of the door reminded him of what he lacked. He had no one to share the harvest with, no voice to greet him at dusk, no small hands to tug at his coat. The land gave him sustenance, but not companionship, and though his heart longed for connection, he had learned to bury those desires beneath the routine of labor. The West was unforgiving, and for a man alone, it demanded not hope, but endurance. Still, the nights were the hardest. Sitting by the dim light of a lantern, he often wondered if the laughter of others was right, if perhaps his life truly was destined to end in silence. Yet even in those dark hours, he carried within him a quiet longing, a hidden prayer for a chance, no matter how small, to feel the warmth of belonging. That fragile hope was a secret, one that even the harshest mockery could not extinguish. And then, one morning, everything changed. The rising sun revealed a figure at the edge of his land, a child, lost and frightened, her clothes torn and eyes wide with desperation. She stumbled toward him, her voice trembling as she whispered a single word that pierced his heart deeper than any ridicule ever had. "Father." In that instant, the farmer's world, once defined by emptiness, shifted completely. The neighbor's mockery would soon be silenced, for destiny had answered the farmer's silent longing in a way no one could have foreseen. What began as ridicule would transform into awe, as the plains bore witness to a bond forged not by blood, but by love, courage, and the unyielding power of the heart. The story of the lonely farmer was no longer about isolation. It was about the extraordinary moment when despair gave way to a future forever changed. The child's voice lingered in the farmer's mind long after the word had been spoken. "Father." It was a single syllable, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime of longing, cutting deeper than any insult he had endured. The farmer knelt before her, his rough hands trembling as he brushed the dust from her face. She was fragile, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, yet within them burned a spark of hope, the same hope he had buried for so many years. In that instant, he realized that fate had not abandoned him. It had delivered him a chance at redemption. The neighbors, who had mocked his solitude for so long, peered from a distance, their laughter silenced by disbelief. Whispers spread like wildfire, each person wondering how a man once scorned for his loneliness could suddenly become the center of such a miraculous turn of events. Some doubted the child's words, dismissing them as confusion born of fear, while others saw in it a divine sign. The farmer paid them no mind. His attention remained fixed on the girl who had chosen him with a single word. As he led her to his cabin, the child clutched his hand with a desperate strength, as if afraid the world would tear them apart. Inside, he offered her water and bread, the only provisions he had, and watched as she ate with the hunger of someone who had wandered too far, too long. Her silence spoke volumes, but every glance toward him carried trust, as if she believed he could shield her from the dangers of the West. That trust, unspoken yet powerful, filled the farmer's hollow chest with a warmth he had not felt in years. Night fell, and the farmer sat by the fire, the child asleep beside him. He listened to the crackle of the flames and the quiet breathing of the girl, realizing that his life had been altered in ways words could not capture. His cabin, once an empty shell echoing with silence, now pulsed with the fragile heartbeat of a family. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of responsibility not as a burden, but as a gift, a chance to prove that even the loneliest soul could rise to meet destiny. Yet deep within him stirred a quiet fear. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And why had she chosen him of all people? The West was a land of secrets, where every miracle carried a shadow, and he knew that this story, though miraculous, had only just begun. The following morning, The farmer awoke to find the child already awake, her small hands tracing patterns in the dust near the hearth. She looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years, filled with questions she could not yet put into words. He asked her name, but she only shook her head, lowering her gaze. There was mystery in her silence, yet also a quiet bond growing between them, a bond forged not by blood, but by the recognition of shared loneliness. When he stepped outside, the neighbors had gathered near the edge of his land. Their mocking expressions had shifted into curiosity, and some even carried traces of envy. They whispered to one another, speculating about the child's origins, their voices carrying across the breeze. She called him father, one muttered, as though the words themselves carried power. The farmer ignored their stares, unwilling to allow their judgment to rob him of the fragile peace that had settled inside his home. Instead, he focused on the work at hand, tending his fields with the girl at his side. Though she was too young to help, her presence transformed every task. The soil seemed less heavy, the rows less endless, and the air itself less cruel. She followed him closely, mimicking his movements, her laughter soft and hesitant, but enough to cut through the loneliness that had once haunted every corner of his land. For the farmer, even silence became companionship, and every step he took beside her felt like a step toward renewal. By midday, he noticed the girl scanning the horizon with a searching gaze, as if waiting for someone. Her eyes lingered on the distant hills, filled with both longing and dread. The farmer felt a pang of unease, sensing that her arrival was not accidental. The West was a place where every story carried hidden scars, and he knew that the child's past would one day find its way to his door. Still, as she turned to him and smiled shyly, he made a silent promise. Whatever shadows lay behind her, she would never again face them alone. That night, as the neighbors continued to whisper, the farmer sat by the fire with the child close beside him, realizing that love is not always born of blood, it is born of choice. And in choosing to see her not as a burden, but as his own, he had rewritten the course of his life forever. The man once mocked for his solitude was no longer alone. He had been given a purpose, and with it, the strength to face whatever trials the untamed West would place in his path. The third day began with a strange stillness, the kind that seemed to warn of change. The farmer awoke to find the child sitting by the window, staring at the horizon with a gaze too solemn for her tender years. Her small frame was outlined by the rising sun, and though she said nothing, the silence was filled with unspoken questions. Who was she waiting for? What loss had carved such depth into her eyes? The farmer, though curious, chose patience, knowing the plains revealed truths in their own time. The whispers in the village grew louder. Some claimed she was the orphan of a family lost to bandits. Others insisted she had wandered from a distant settlement. Rumors clung to the air like dust, feeding suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. The farmer, once mocked for his solitude, now found himself the center of attention, his cabin no longer ignored but watched closely. It was not pity that drove their stares now. It was envy, fear, and a cautious fascination with the mystery that had entered his life. That afternoon, while working the fields, the farmer noticed the girl mimicking his every move, as if the rhythm of planting and tending the soil grounded her in a way words could not. Each time he turned, she mirrored him, her small hands shaping the earth with an earnest determination. It was in these moments that he saw her transformation. Her silence was not emptiness, but resilience, a quiet act of survival. And in her persistence, the farmer found strength reflected back at him, reminding him that even broken hearts could learn to beat again. Later, as the sun lowered, he caught sight of a figure on horseback lingering at the far edge of the plains. The rider did not approach, but remained still, watching before disappearing into the hills. The farmer's heart tightened with unease. He wondered if the child's past was riding closer, carried by strangers who might claim what he had already begun to love as his own. Yet as the girl slipped her hand into his, calling him father, once more, he knew he could never let her be taken without a fight. That night, the wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters as if echoing the turmoil in his chest. For the first time, the farmer realized that his loneliness had been replaced with something far more powerful, and far more fragile. He had something to lose now, and that truth, though terrifying, gave him a sense of purpose that no amount of ridicule or hardship could ever erase. The following day brought the farmer into the village for supplies, the child clinging to his hand as whispers followed them through the dusty streets. Some offered soft smiles, others narrowed their eyes, muttering words meant to wound. "She's not his," someone sneered under their breath, but the farmer ignored them, keeping his gaze forward. Every step was a declaration. This child had chosen him, and he would honor that choice with unyielding resolve. At the trading post, an older woman with kind eyes bent down to speak to the girl. "Where did you come from, little one?" she asked gently, but the child pressed closer to the farmer's side, refusing to speak. The woman raised her eyebrows, but the farmer only offered a polite nod, gathering his supplies with quiet determination. He understood now that her silence was not weakness. It was armor, forged by whatever trial she had endured before finding him. On the way home, the child tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward a grove of trees where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the arid land. They stopped, and she knelt to gather a small handful, pressing them into his calloused hands. For the farmer, it was more than a gift. It was a vow, a fragile promise that despite the shadows of her past, she had found light in his presence. His chest swelled with emotion, realizing that sometimes family is not given, but chosen, and that love can take root even in the harshest soil. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the farmer told her stories of the plains, the hardships of the land, the strength it demanded, and the resilience it taught. Though she said nothing, her eyes glimmered in the firelight, absorbing every word as though each story stitched her more firmly into the fabric of his life. He realized that his words, once spoken into silence, now carried meaning, shaping the bond that was steadily growing between them. But even as warmth filled his cabin, the unease of the rider on the horizon gnawed at his thoughts. He knew the West rarely granted peace without demanding a price, and though the girl called him father, he feared the day might come when her past returned to claim her, testing the very strength of the love that had already begun to heal them both. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy calm. The farmer tended his fields as always, but now with the child at his side, her small presence transforming every furrow into a reminder of his new purpose. Yet beneath the rhythm of work, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. At dusk, he often caught the faint glimmer of a distant rider, a shadow that lingered on the horizon before vanishing into the hills. The land had always been vast and untamed, but now it carried secrets that pressed against his heart. The whispers in the village grew sharper. "Someone will come for her," they muttered. "No child wanders the plains alone." Their words carried both curiosity and warning, but also a cruel satisfaction, as if waiting for the farmer's fragile happiness to be torn away. He ignored them, though the unease gnawed at him. Still, every time the girl slipped her hand into his, calling him father with that fragile voice, he knew he would not surrender her, not to whispers, nor to shadows, nor to the past she carried in silence. One evening, while repairing the fence along his property, the farmer found something strange, a small ribbon caught between the wood, frayed but delicate, as though torn from a garment in haste. He showed it to the girl, but her eyes clouded with fear, and she quickly turned away, retreating into silence. It was the first sign that her past was closer than he wanted to believe, the first confirmation that someone, somewhere, was searching. That night, as the fire crackled, the child pressed close to him, her small frame trembling. She whispered again, "Father," but this time it carried a note of desperation, as if she feared he might disappear like everything else she had once known. The farmer held her tightly, vowing in his heart that no force of man or fate would break the bond that had already grown between them. But as the wind howled outside and shadows stretched across the plains, he knew the test was coming. The West was a land that stripped men bare, revealing whether their hearts were built of courage or cowardice. Soon, he would discover which one defined him. The following morning, the farmer rose before dawn, his instincts sharpened by unease. He led the child to the creek, teaching her how to wash her face in the cool water, how to find the tracks of rabbits and deer along the muddy banks. Her laughter, though faint, broke through the weight of fear, and for a moment the world seemed almost gentle. Yet as the sun climbed, he noticed hoofprints pressed fresh into the earth. Not his, not hers, but from riders who had passed in the night. Back at the cabin, the farmer busied himself with chores, but his mind turned constantly to the horizon. The child lingered nearby, quietly helping where she could, her small hands carrying water, gathering kindling, imitating his every move. In her silent companionship, he found strength, as though her presence had filled a void he never admitted was there. Yet with every glance to the hills, he was reminded that shadows of her past were creeping closer, ready to test the life they were building together. That afternoon, while the child napped, the farmer sharpened his old rifle, a relic he had seldom used. He was no man of violence, but the West allowed little room for weakness. As he worked, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier on his shoulders. Protecting his land was one thing. Protecting her was something far greater. It was not just his survival at stake now. It was hers, and with it, the fragile hope that had entered his life with a single word. By evening, neighbors passed by, offering curious stares and half-hearted greetings. One muttered, "It won't last. Someone will come to take her back." The farmer met their gaze with a steadiness they had never seen in him before. The man they once mocked for his loneliness now stood taller, hardened not by bitterness, but by love, a force more enduring than any ridicule. He did not speak, but his silence carried a promise. He would fight for her, no matter the cost. As night fell, the distant cry of coyotes echoed across the plains, mingling with the farmer's unspoken fears. He sat by the fire, watching the child sleep peacefully, her small face illuminated by the glow. The West was testing him, as it always did, but this time the trial was not his alone. And though he could not know what awaited them beyond the horizon, he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer the lonely farmer mocked by the world. He was a father, and he would prove it. The following days carried a strange tension, as though the land itself was waiting. The farmer noticed that the child had grown restless, often gazing at the hills where the rider had last appeared. At night, she woke crying softly, whispering words he could not understand, but always clutching his arm as if afraid he would vanish. The farmer soothed her, though his own heart pounded with the weight of questions left unanswered. Each day he prayed the rider would remain only a shadow, yet deep down he knew the plains rarely left mysteries unsolved. The whispers in the village turned sharper, more pointed. Some accused him of stealing the child. Others hinted that trouble would soon arrive at his doorstep. He bore their suspicion in silence, just as he had endured their ridicule before, but now the stakes were higher. Their words no longer wounded only him. They threatened the fragile peace he had built with the child who had chosen him. Each insult became fuel for his determination, hardening his resolve to protect her at any cost. One evening, as he worked the field, he caught sight of her standing at the fence line, her small figure silhouetted against the fading sun. She whispered, "Father," once more, her voice trembling with both love and fear. He walked to her, kneeling so their eyes met, and promised that no one, no shadow, no rider, no rumor, would take her from his side. In her gaze, he saw both trust and dread, and it cut through him like a blade, knowing that the trials of the West were only tightening their grip. That night, he sat awake long after the fire died, staring into the darkness beyond his cabin walls. The silence of the plains, once comforting, now felt alive with unseen threats. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of the wind, carried the weight of something approaching. His hand rested on the old rifle beside him, his heart divided between fear of what might come and the unshakable resolve to face it when it did. By dawn, he had made his decision. If the rider returned, he would no longer stand idle. The West had mocked his loneliness long enough, and now it would test his courage. For the first time, the farmer felt not just like a caretaker, but like a father ready to fight for his child, no matter the price. The test came sooner than expected. As the sun climbed high, the distant sound of hooves shattered the uneasy calm. The farmer's heart tightened as he saw two riders cresting the hill, their figures stark against the horizon. The child's face drained of color, her small hand clutching his coat as though trying to anchor herself to him. Her silence screamed louder than words, confirming his fear. These were no strangers. They were tied to the past she had fled. The riders approached with deliberate slowness, their eyes sharp, their posture commanding. The villagers gathered in the distance, drawn by the promise of spectacle. The same mouths that had mocked him now whispered with anticipation, eager to see if the lonely farmer would falter when confronted. Yet he stood tall, his hand resting lightly on the rifle at his side, not in threat but in warning. This was no longer the man they had ridiculed. This was a man who had something to protect. The child buried her face against his chest, trembling as the riders dismounted. One of them, a weathered man with eyes as cold as iron, stepped forward and demanded the girl by name. The farmer's stomach clenched at the sound. It was proof that she belonged to a story deeper and darker than he had imagined. Yet as she pressed closer to him, whispering "Father" again, he knew in his bones that her place was no longer with them. It was with him. A silence heavier than steel settled over the plains. The wind stilled, the villagers held their breath, and the farmer's heart thundered in his chest. He did not know how this confrontation would end, only that he could not surrender her without betraying the very life she had given back to him. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a man who had already made his choice. She's mine now. She stays. The riders exchanged dark glances, their eyes narrowing, but the farmer did not flinch. He had lived through mockery, endured loneliness, and survived the unforgiving land. Now he stood unshaken, a man transformed by love and responsibility. The West had mocked him for years, but now would witness his defiance. And in that fragile, defiant stand, the fate of his newfound family balanced on a knife's edge. The tension at the cabin thickened, like a storm about to break. The two riders studied the farmer with cold, calculating eyes, as though measuring the strength of the man who dared to defy them. The villagers kept their distance, forming a silent semicircle on the ridge, hungry for spectacle. Their whispers, once mocking, had now turned into hushed disbelief. This was no longer the quiet, lonely man they had laughed at. This was someone transformed, a man standing unyielding before forces larger than himself. The girl clung to him, her fingers digging into his coat, her breathing shallow with fear. For her, this was not merely a confrontation. It was a reckoning with the shadows she had fled. The farmer felt her trembling and placed his weathered hand gently over hers, anchoring her in place. In his heart, he knew she was not his by blood, but she had chosen him, and that choice had given him a new life. To surrender her now would be to lose not only her, but himself. One of the riders stepped forward, his boots crunching the dirt. His voice was sharp, his tone filled with authority. "She belongs with us." The words sliced through the air like a knife, leaving no room for doubt. Yet the farmer's response came with steady defiance, his voice firm, shaped by years of silence, now broken by purpose. "She belongs where she is safe," he answered, "and that is here." The air grew still, the plains holding their breath. The farmer could feel every eye on him. Every whisper of doubt turned into a prayer for resolution. He had never been a man of speeches, but his words carried the weight of truth. In that moment, he was not simply defending a child. He was defending the very idea that love, loyalty, and courage could stand against fear, cruelty, and possession. The riders exchanged a glance, their frustration evident. They had expected an easy claim, but instead they found themselves facing a man willing to risk everything for a child who had called him father. The silence stretched, the air heavy with the possibility of violence, as the fate of the girl, and the farmer himself, balanced on the edge of decision. The standoff seemed endless. The tension stretched taut across the plains. Then, as if carried by the land itself, the child raised her voice. For the first time, she spoke more than a single word, her voice breaking with fear, yet filled with conviction. "I don't want to go. He's my father." Her cry shattered the silence, echoing through the crowd and piercing even the hardest of hearts. The farmer's eyes burned with unshed tears, but his stance remained solid, his body a shield between her and the men who would take her away. In that moment, the child's declaration transformed everything. It was no longer about bloodlines or claims. It was about choice, about love forged in the fires of survival and acceptance. Even the villagers, who had once mocked him, now looked upon him with newfound respect, their whispers silenced by the girl's courage. The riders hesitated, the child's words hanging in the air heavier than any weapon. They could see it in her eyes. She would not leave him willingly. To drag her away now would mean tearing apart something sacred, something that even the plains seemed to protect. Reluctantly, they mounted their horses, their gazes hard but their will broken. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the horizon, leaving only the echo of hooves fading in the distance. The farmer stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the battle he had just fought without firing a single shot. The girl clung to him, her tears dampening his shirt, and he knew that though the struggle was far from over, they had won the day. For the first time, he felt the fullness of fatherhood, not by blood, but by love, chosen and defended with everything he had. As the sun set behind them, casting golden light across the cabin, the farmer understood that the West had tested him in the cruelest of ways. And yet, in that test, it had given him a gift far greater than he had ever dreamed: a family, a purpose, and a legacy built not on loneliness, but on courage and love. The farmer stood at the edge of his land as the last rays of the sun spread across the plains. What had begun as mockery of his loneliness had ended with the gift of a family, a bond forged not through blood, but through love and sacrifice. He realized that the greatest victories are not found in wealth or power, but in the moments when courage dares to protect what the heart refuses to let go. His silence, once ridiculed, had now become the voice of defiance, of resilience, and of love unbreakable. The villagers, who had once sneered at him, now looked upon him with a reverence they could not deny. They had witnessed a man rise above humiliation and fear, choosing to stand firm in the face of threats far stronger than himself. What they saw was not just a farmer, but a father, defined not by title or bloodline, but by the unshakable will to love and protect. In that truth lay a lesson for all, that even the loneliest among us can become guardians when guided by the strength of the heart. As the child clung to him, whispering the word "Father" once more, the farmer felt a peace he had never known. The West had tested him with isolation, with cruelty, and with shadows of fear, but in the end it had rewarded him with purpose. His journey was proof that love is not always given. It is sometimes chosen, discovered in the most unlikely places, and defended with every fiber of one's being. The plains, vast and unforgiving, had become the backdrop of his transformation. And as the wind carried whispers across the land, it seemed to tell his story, a reminder that redemption often arrives in unexpected ways, that courage is born in the quiet moments of choice, and that no heart is truly forgotten by fate. What began as loneliness had become legacy, and the once mocked farmer now stood as proof that even the smallest lives can alter the course of many. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. What would you have done if you stood in his place? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let your voice be part of this journey. And if you want to keep discovering more tales of resilience, courage, and unexpected redemption from the Old West, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your presence here keeps these stories alive, ensuring they echo far beyond the horizon.